Hey everyone. Today I wanted to talk about a way I really like to learn. And it's something that I've discussed in previous videos as well, but I like to follow current tournaments and check out, the games of the players and really try to learn from the games. I don't always follow as the event's going. Sometimes I do that. It's a nice training method if I have the time. But a lot of the times I just play through after and I try to figure out what they're doing. Trying to avoid computer analysis can be treacherous, but it does tend to help, and it's something which I find really nice. But one tool which I really like using is focusing on a particular player and something they do well, and try to learn from that particular player in those types of positions. So today, as you would probably guess from the title, we're focusing on MVL, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, French Grandmaster, who's been an elite GM for a very long time. And he's a very particular player in that, like, he has a unique style. Only MVL plays like MVL. I think at that level, most of them, have their own things, but he definitely has a distinct style, types of positions he plays. And one of the things that I think makes him extremely strong, obviously there are lots of factors and lots of different building blocks that make an elite GM. But I think that one of the things that he does particularly well is finding counterplay, particularly in positions where he's either worse or down material or up against it in some way. For a player like him who tends to be pretty challenging, like he'll take on the main line, so he'll try to play really sharp stuff. He likes to play sharp positions. He draws a lot. He's even on some crazy draw streak. I think in the Sinquefield Cup, which is currently going on in St. Louis, he's drawn every game. And it's not for lack of trying. It's not like he's, not trying to win. It's just that part of it is that he does get some positions where he's a bit up against it, and he defends so well that he's very, very difficult to beat. And I think that's one of the reasons. So delving into the positions, let's start with this position. So this position is black to move. This is a game he played against Gukesh, the Indian Grandmaster. Well, one of one of a few. And current world championship challenger, I might add. So this game was a pretty crucial game. So he was black, and Gukesh actually stole this a6 pawn with a brutal tactic. It was very funny. It was something where the bishop took this pawn, and black could recapture, but they'd have to allow a bishop to take this knight because of a pin. There was a whole tactical thing. We're not getting into it. But basically, MVL finds himself down a pawn and was in a little bit of trouble. But Gukesh played a couple moves that were maybe a bit passive. So here's a chance to challenge yourself if you haven't seen the game. What do you think MVL will do? Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the positions I give don't necessarily have one best move. Sometimes there are several moves. Sometimes the move played in the game wasn't best, so don't assume if he played something it was the best. But this is black to move. How would you create counterplay here? So once again, with my videos, definitely if you have the ability to pause them, it is very helpful as far as trying to learn from them. Obviously, you can just play through them, but then you won't get a chance to solve the position. So the main thing here is, at the moment, MVL has this pin on the knight, which is very nice. The pin on this g3 knight. And the e4 pawn is a little bit weak, but nothing crazy. The d pawn's also weak, to be fair. But it's one of those positions where MVL realizes that if he plays slowly, he's going to get eventually overrun. Like, white will sort their pieces out. Maybe they'll bring their bishop back. Maybe the knight will plant itself on d5 at some point, or he'll target the pawn, could improve a king. Like, white will have improving moves that will, eventually make it so that the extra pawn really is what counts, right? So one way I was considering when I saw this position during the game was a move like h5. So a move like h5 I think is perfectly okay here. It's a normal thing. So the idea would be that at some point white will break the pin, let's say bishop f2, you withdraw the bishop, and now you're ready to play this h4 move. And at first I thought this was kind of nice. But white can play a move like bishop b5, and this is actually really irritating because they're going to trade off your bishop, which will limit your counterplay. And importantly, if you play h4 now, the knight slips back here, and white's sort of sorting out their pieces. And keep in mind that if white gets their pieces sorted out and starts pressing you, you're going to really feel the heat, not just because you're down a pawn, but I mean, white has a lot of nice squares in the center. Like a knight landing on d5 at some point could be very annoying. The d pawn is very weak. You have to be very careful of giving white this kind of time. So h5 is not a bad move. But MVL played a move which to my eye looked very, very risky, but also the more you look at it, makes sense. He plays f5. So this is, again, I feel like this is a classic MVL kind of move. He senses that his position is not one he can sit with. There are times he'll defend more patiently, but in general, he likes to defend actively like most players do, but he does it particularly well. And he senses that, okay, I could kind of sit back and just, have my compensation, but I would rather get some concrete play. And I think here it works out. This does open the king, which should make you a bit nervous. But the reason why we can get away with it is because we have this pin, and white's pieces are not really well equipped to take advantage. For example, if takes on f5, I play knight takes f5. So again, we have this pin on the knight, which makes this knight, so they can't just capture. At least not without sacrificing a queen, which I think is a bit much to ask. I was actually vaguely considering this, but it's a bit much. Knight h6 check doesn't do enough. Knight takes d6, I'll probably just move my bishop. I mean, probably not. Probably not. It is fun to think about, but yeah, probably bishop f2 or some move like this. But now you have all sorts of ideas, for example, taking and queen g5, and all of a sudden you actually have a lot of play. The bishop's pinned to the g-pawn. The computer actually claims here you can sack the exchange on f5 and be okay as white, which I kind of believe, just because, again, our king is very weak. White will have the two bishops, but it's definitely... Black has tons of counterplay. Like, black's doing fine here. And you can understand why Gukesh would not opt to take that pawn. So Gukesh played a very natural move, bishop f2. So once again, how do you continue in MVL's shoes? So he found, so rather than try to take stuff, which doesn't really work out, I mean, the knight will take, you could try to grab pawns with something like this, but this is the kind of thing that's fraught with danger. The knight is pinned to, like, you have all these pieces pinned, you have a wide open king. This is just not a very good way to play in general. I'm not exactly sure what white would play here specifically, but you have lots of options. I mean, trying to bring the bishop out to b5, again, I think an option like this could be very nasty. So again, you're just going to take this e-pawn. And I'm not exactly sure that's best. You could also consider, like, one thing I was considering was also check and, like, popping a bishop here, or, putting a knight there. I don't know if I like that as much. You can also bring a piece to the 7th. There are just so many scary things that you can do here in white's shoes. Maybe you don't even have to go too crazy. I mean, I guess knight f5 is coming, so that's the one option. But in general, this is just not what you want to do. And someone like MVL is very good at knowing that. He has a good sense of what I would call dynamics. And what that means is, and in this case, I probably would be in the same boat, which is just that I don't think I would consider taking this knight very strongly. Yes, you win your pawn back, but your whole center is weak. There's all sorts of ideas. Again, I'm not even 100% sure what I would be afraid of. I just know I would not want to do it. And I think that MVL is kind of in that boat as well, which is just that, he knows that that's not really the right approach. So his approach, I think, is a lot better and more natural, which is he plays f4. So this knight has to get forced back to h1. And trading the dark square bishops isn't even that bad by itself, but that would bring the knight back into the game. He doesn't want to do that, so he plays the very nice move, knight bishop g5. So the idea is now this knight on h1 is kind of garbage. The knight's coming out to e6, and black is still down a pawn. He didn't win his pawn back, but he has such huge counterplay due to white's bad pieces. At some point, maybe even a move like f3, trying to disrupt white's kingside. And this really got him back in the game. Now, he actually messed up a bit and maybe was worse again, and it was, it's a normal game of chess. There's mistakes back and forth. But playing this way and knowing the right moment to play this f5 move really got him back in a game where he was kind of down a pawn and wasn't doing so hot. So being able to sense that moment where this is where I have to try to spring my counterplay is very important. So note a few things about the moment. Number one, at the moment, white is tied up, but these are temporary things that can be fixed. White can play bishop f2. White can move the bishop to b5. And and then make sure that your counterplay, if it opens up your king, make sure you have ways to keep your king safe. If you open up your king too much, then that's not good. The other main thing I would mention is do not be in too much of a hurry to cash in your and take your pawn back. A lot of mistakes are made because people try to take their pawn back too early, not realizing they've torched their whole position. So make sure that you're not in a hurry to cash back in, and notice how he focuses on driving white's pieces out of play, keeping the game complex. Notice how it's a complex pawn structure. The pawn on f4 is kind of annoying. He has this knight. So even though he's still down a pawn, you don't really feel the extra pawn yet because it's not really doing much for now. Obviously, in the long term, you have to worry about it, but he's not in a hurry to cash in, and he's really just focused on maximizing his pieces while keeping whites at bay. So I think that's a good example for this. Let's move on to the next one. So I have to say the previous one, I looked at h5 briefly, but when I saw f5, I kind of understood, and that was something that was a bit more intuitive. I have to admit that this one was definitely not. But okay, so this position, he's black against Fabiano. You know, obviously I don't need to introduce him too much, but very, very strong. And in this game was kind of, you know, back and forth, but definitely I liked Fabi's position at some point. I would say that more than other top players, I find that MVL gets a lot of bad positions. I don't know if it's opening prep, like his prep is pretty good, but at the same time, I think his openings are more predictable than the others. And sometimes, you know, and he does play riskier systems a lot of the time. So he does get some worse positions. So, and I think that's part of why he's become so good at getting himself out. That's why he's so difficult to beat, even for the best in the world. So, in any case, so he has this position, and the question is, how do you keep counterplay here? I mean, you're down a pawn. It's not the biggest deal. It's a doubled pawn, but how do you secure counterplay if you're MVL here? So it's black to play. So in this case, what I wanted to do turns out to not be so bad. I wanted to just play rook d8 was the move I wanted, right? You keep material on the board, you defend this knight on e5. You do have to give up the e5 pawn, which is perhaps what he didn't care for. The e5 pawn, it looks like, okay, it's a doubled pawn, but it kind of secures the dark squares in the center. But my thinking was that after takes, and either piece can take here, but the queen I thought was a bit more logical. I mean, taking on h4 looks weird. So, I mean, I was going to take this pawn. And I think black's doing okay. Computer says it's about equal also. It's basically this b pawn is weak. Black's pieces are active. And very importantly, white's king is less safe than black's. And I think that's really crucial to the position. Of course, it can still go either way. But I do think that this position is quite comfortable. Or at the very least, you know, not worse for black. MVL's line is also good. But it's one where it's, for me, it was much harder to see, and I'm curious if other people would get it too. But it's a great example of how he finds counterplay, because while he does go by, like in the previous one, I feel like it wasn't as much calculation. It was more knowing you had to act and then realizing that you could chase the white knight away, stay down a pawn, but, you know, improve your pieces. Here, it's largely about calculation, and that's something that he excels at. He uses his strong calculation to find counterplay, and he does that here. He takes on a3, which at first looks kind of crazy, fixing white's pawns. Of course, white can take this way, but we're very happy in a position like this. We get to, it's the same thing. We do trade rooks, which limits our play, but we also keep our e5 pawn, which again, it's a doubled pawn, but it is far from useless. It keeps everything together. To be honest, I would probably take black here, even though, again, computer says dead equal, but I think most people would take black with the safer king. Just my thought. But he takes with the a pawn, and here he takes the knight. So notice how he's not afraid of these connected passed pawns. A lot of people would just not do this. They'd see the connected passed pawns, they'd be like, why am I doing this? But he uses concrete calculation to solve his problem. He plays queen a7. So one nice thing about this is, apart from keeping the e5 pawn, he also gets knight versus bishop, which I think is what helped him decide to do this, because I think that the bishop in this kind of position with this structure is not that great of a piece. It often has to kind of take a defensive role, in which case it's, you know, it's okay, but it's not great, and the knight's a superior piece, which is why I think he does this. It's one of those things where, again, I probably would play rook d8, but I'm very, like, if I saw and calculated what he did, obviously I'm nowhere near the calculator he is, I would understand why he would do this, and I would think about doing it as well. So the key here, it really is based on tactics. So the queen can move, but of course it's fraught with danger with this diagonal. If you try to play here, and this is very important to see, by the way, if you didn't calculate this, you should not do this, which is that he has the move knight takes f3. So at first it looks like it's winning a queen, like, yeah, we get to take this queen. But of course white plays king f2. But the key here is the knight comes back, and even though white keeps these connected pawns, they can't really move. It's very, very difficult to move these pawns, and the white king is weak enough that I think that black really has nothing to worry about here. Obviously, precise play is required, both sides can do well, yada yada, but I don't think that black is too much to fear. I would say that the connected pass pawns, if I can say a stereotype, are actually overvalued, because players realize how strong they are early and then they get terrified of them. If they have trouble moving, they're not always that great. And I would say that players often underestimate a weak king. So I think white's weak king compensates for that. It's still, again, computer just says everything's equal, and it's right. I'm sure it's right. But again, from a human perspective, I totally get why Fabi played what he did, which is bishop f1. So he allows MVL to take this pawn, but he secures his king. So he plays queen d2. So MVL improves the king a little bit. He plays king h7. And they actually agreed to a draw in a funny way. It was here, queen a7 threatening a discovery, queen g3, queen a1 tickling the bishop, king f2, etc., etc. It wasn't necessary, but I think it's very clear that, black has a really nice knight, has a solid position, but it's hard to target the king without rooks. That's the one thing with trading rooks. It's harder to target the king in a way, I should say, to win the game. Like, you're not going to mate the king. It's just, if white tries to push their pawn or tries to do something, they're going to have trouble because their king is weak. So it's one of those positions where the king is a bit weak, but you can't use it to win the game. It just gives you enough counterplay. So again, he found, and in this whole game, he had to find different resources as well. I would encourage you to check out the whole game, but it was quite something how he managed to really diffuse Fabi's play. And again, diffusing Fabi's play as white is not the easiest thing in the world. So next I want to move to this last example. This one, he's black against Firouzja. Really, really sharp game. And this is another thing which I like about him as a player, and I think a lot of players can learn from, which is that he's not really afraid of, entering certain positions with people. Like, he's playing Firouzja, who's an amazing calculator, who's great at sharp positions, but he really believes in his own play and his own skills, and I think that this is a good thing to emulate. Now, there obviously are situations where, let's say, if your opponent's really bad at certain types of positions, you can aim for those instead of the ones they're good at. I don't think you should be stupid about it. But I think that believing in your own, abilities is important. Like, confidence is important. And I think that he's like, Firouzja, he likes these sharp positions, but so do I. I'll be fine. But this game, he definitely was a little up against it, as is sometimes the case. He gets into a bit of trouble. I don't want to say that he's like doing that horribly here, but definitely there are lots of potential payoffs, right? So at the moment, he is down a pawn, seems to be his habit. He's down a pawn a lot, but I have to say, at first when I saw his position, I quite liked it. At least the two bishops look like they have a lot of potential. The central pawns, the e5, d5 pawns, are potentially very strong, but his king is not exactly glorious here. So the question is, how do you try to secure counterplay in this position? What would you do if you were in MVL shoes here, facing the mighty Firouzja? So you could play a move like bishop h6. I was looking at moves like this a lot during the game, but the problem is that white launches with g4, and it's just really difficult. You have to watch out for so many moves. Now, I can take this pawn, and try to bring a rook over. I could bring a rook over. Even moves like g5 are in the air sometimes, just ripping apart your king. It's not so easy to respond to a move like this. And I didn't really see a great response. So I think that what MVL does here, what he senses, which is absolutely correct, is that this bishop on g7 is already serving a function, as ugly as it is. It's keeping your king kind of guarded. The piece that is not serving a function is this bishop on b7. So one thing you'll notice about MVL's games, and I think it's a great thing to learn from him, is that more than even other elite players, he hates having bad pieces. He hates it. And I think it's a very common feature of dynamic players. I would also say the funny thing is very positional players also don't like having pieces out of play, which I find funny also. But he really does not like it. And I think that here it serves him well, because this bishop on b7 is totally useless, and getting it back in the game is important. So he plays this move. And this is a really excellent move. It's worth noting that he's inviting white to take this pawn, but now if he plays bishop h6, he has things under control. He's ready to play king g7. He'll probably pick up the pawn at his leisure. I don't think he's going to go too crazy trying to put a king on g6, but he might. I mean, at some point he'll take it, I'm sure. But the bishop's very, very active now. And the point is that if you try g4, this is actually not working now because you can capture, and bishop takes g4. And this bishop not only hits the rook, but also serves as a great defender because it's locked in by the pawns. And here, actually, black's already doing very, very well. So Vachier plays the best move, I believe. He plays the move g4. He does not need a second invitation to start throwing pawns at your king. I don't think most of us would in this case. So once again, we need to figure out what is MVL going to do. He's getting attacked. And I think this is where also he's very good, and this is a quality which I think that we should all aim to kind of emulate, which is that even when he's getting attacked, even when his position is very risky, he does not panic. He is not a panicky player where he starts like pitching stuff or doing things. Obviously, to be elite, you can't be like too panicky anyway. But I would say that while he does have some danger sense, he definitely is not, panicking with all his moves and things like that. So he plays it calm, but the question is, what is the calm response to this? Like, what should he be doing? So what do you think? Once again, if you want to pause and try to figure out what MVL does here. So first of all, what you should not do is capture on g4. The main reason is because you're inviting the queen to come back in the game. And after queen takes g4, you're just going to get viciously attacked. Yes, you have this center, but with a king this open, you're going to find it very difficult. So I think this is just a poor decision. G takes f5, I don't like either, although it turns out computer thinks this is fine. And this is one of those cases where I would be like, ooh, I don't know. But the idea is basically that after knight takes f5, bishop takes f5, g takes f5, you can play king h8, play bishop h6. I would be terrified of, like, something like here, or rook landing here, this queen coming back, but apparently it's all sort of stuff you can take care of. I think that the key is you can counterattack this pawn so that queen d1 doesn't work, and if the queen drops back to c2, you have moves like e4, all of this. Again, I'm not saying this is the best line, but I think white's supposed to do something else for that reason. But the whole point is, like, tactically it holds together. It kind of works. But what MVL does, which I really like, is he keeps a bit more tension, and he plays the move e4. So I really like this move in a lot of ways. Number one, it prevents like this knight from getting in. It blocks the queen from getting in the game, and it keeps the tension. And this is something which is kind of a noted thing, that like weaker players have more trouble maintaining tension than stronger players. Like weaker players, you notice, and it's true with like a lot of levels as well. It's not just like beginner or intermediate or anything like that. That when a player who's like not as experienced or not as strong is playing someone who's a better player, often the better player maintains the tension longer and is more comfortable with that. That's one of the reasons they're better. And if you can learn to be comfortable with tension, be comfortable with pawns attacking each other, and be willing to do this, you're gonna become a better player if you're able to do this. But it does involve calculation, right? Like you have to make sure, if you calculate, like, okay, after pawn takes, what am I doing? And one of the keys here is that when you take this way, these pawns are quite strong. White can pin you on the h-file, but you can move your king and play this, and you're doing quite okay. If they try to take this pawn, here you have different options, actually, I think. But I think one of the main ones is you can get away with this, because if they try to push, your bishop's here, and these pawns look scary, but they're well blockaded. You can start shoving this pawn. I think this position is very nice. So rook dg1 was played. which I think is a very logical move. So notice how he's bringing that rook. Part of it's to have this rook active. The other part is to have the queen have a way to get back sometimes. I think is actually can be important, at least. Not always. So here, once again, MVL makes a brave choice, which I think is absolutely correct. He plays h takes g4. If you don't play this, this is where patience is kind of not going to help you. White just has so many pieces pointed at your king. You can't afford, if king h7, they take on g6 with check. There are too many things happening. You cannot afford to be patient any longer. This is not a time where you can have that patience. This is where you have to take this pawn. And Firouzja finally makes a mistake. The best move here, and it is far from obvious, is the move h5. And this is where I think we would have seen like some weird stuff, because here this is not something I think most players would find. So I'm not sure what MVL's plan was here, or if he had a plan here. G takes f5 looks like the most logical, right? But then there's h6, h7, and this is actually quite annoying, even though the pawn's not going to queen. And even though these pawns look super strong, at least to me, the problem is white's kind of ready to do this. And because the king is so weak, it's hard for the pawns to move. If you play f4, I'll take on g4. The knight's going to head to d4. Even though these pawns look very scary, it's very difficult to move them. And that's the reason why, you know, I wouldn't, like, black's not lost necessarily, anything like that, but black's in a bit of trouble. I think also computer likes going here, which I find kind of insane. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't so interested exactly in that, because I think, you know, we're trying to learn as human beings, and I think playing this is, to us, it just looks like a mess. This is not like, oh, for sure white's better kind of position. And I can definitely understand why Firouzja would not be comfortable with that. Bishop takes f5 is also a real option. And at first, I was really into this, but one of the keys that's really crazy is after bishop takes pawn, the key is you have to go back. Good luck with that. Because the idea is if bishop takes pawn, rook takes, and you're gonna get slaughtered on the g file. So you have to go back. Computer wants to go back to c8. I refuse to do it. I think e6 was where I wanted to go. c8 is too obnoxious. And apparently you're okay, because this g pawn kind of blocks white's play. You can allow rook h7 and not die. I mean, I don't know. To me, it looked very risky, but I think you're helped in part by the fact that this queen on a4 is not participating. Notice how MVL blocked it off with this very important move e4. So this would have been actually relatively promising for white, but he plays rook takes g4, and this is where MVL strikes. And this is one thing I've noticed which makes him very dangerous, which is that even if his position is bad, because he doesn't panic, because he's always in a calm and good state of mind, he is good at turning the tables, and that's exactly what he does here. He plays g takes f5. Firouzja plays rook g6, trying to keep his rook. Apparently he should go all the way back, but that's not an easy decision to make. And here he continues taking over. So this is a very important moment. It's possible that Firouzja thought that this was the plan for black, trying to run with the king. But the problem is it's very difficult to run. You play a move like this, playing bishop here has its obvious drawbacks. And if you go here, once again, white has this beautiful rejoinder. Queen comes to h5, black's king's in huge, huge trouble. I don't know if this is what he saw or this is what he was counting on. It's very possible, but MVL chooses to push. So this is another very, very important factor to know. And this, again, you could do this largely from calculating. But you also, you know, develop a feel for it, which is that knowing when you have to push and knowing when you have to defend. Here, pushing is actually very useful. You put pressure on this knight. After rook hg1, you don't try to take the knight and give up your queen. The queen, if you have the two rooks against the queen and your king's open, it tends to be very unpleasant because the rooks have to constantly defend. You can't ever use them effectively. So you should play rook e7, which is what he does. And Firouzja has to go back. I'm sure going back was not his plan. But the problem is going up is not so easy either. Your rook ends up trapped a lot. There are moves like king h7, so he has to go back. And now bishop f5, once again causing him to retreat. This is why rook g6 was not as good. f3. But yeah, I'm sure he intended to go forward, and it just doesn't work. So Firouzja plans knight d4, attacking the bishop. And MVL, you could take the rook, but I like his move better. You play bishop back to d7. So the rook drops back to g6, and he plays king h7 on pinning. So you're not trying to move bishop h3. I'm just indicating the bishop controls this diagonal. These pawns are very good. Bishop can come to h6 in a lot of cases, and MVL turned a position which was very difficult where he was getting attacked. He played nice active play, he found his counterplay, and got a position where I think he's actually much better, if not winning. They ended up drawing the game a bit later. I have a feeling time had something to do with it. I think MVL was very low on time trying to find a lot of these moves. Or maybe he misjudged. I don't know what happened exactly. I just know that this position was quite good for him. But it's very complicated, and I'm definitely not showing every line. These positions are not, like, when you see these guys make these mistakes, there's a lot of calculation going behind it. And I tried to show what I could, but I didn't show every single line. So there was a lot of stuff that was hidden beneath. I probably didn't capture exactly what each side missed or things like that. But the important thing is to learn from what he does, which is that he, number one, does not panic even when he's getting attacked. He makes sure all his pieces get good. The moves like bishop c8, getting your pieces into the game. And then knowing when to push forward and when to defend, right? He pushed forward with his pawns at a key moment, and that enabled him to take over the initiative. Whereas if he tried to play more passively and defensively, that would have given white time to regroup with the queen, and that would have ended up very badly. And at the heart of it all, he is calculating a ton. He's calculating a lot and very accurately, and that also adds to it. But there's definitely a large factor of feel and knowing how to create counterplay and how to activate your pieces. And I think this is something we can all learn from him as a player. One of the many things. In any case, I hope you guys like this kind of video. And if you like it, definitely, it helps when you like, subscribe, all of that stuff. That, supports me, it helps encourage me to do more of these videos. So I definitely appreciate all that. If you like my teaching style, you can check out my Chessable courses. They are linked below. And otherwise, I will see you next time.